Welcome back to another edition of Inside Great Lakes Sailing. My name is Greg Norman, your host. Now, we are going to take a page out of last week's episode, which is the start of our fifth season, and we're going to spend some time talking about U.S. Sailing's lawsuit against America One and Paul Cahart. We thought we would go backwards to talk to some guys on the inside, so we got a chance to talk to Gary Jobson, a former U.S. Sailing Executive Board President, and a local Bayview member, Bruce Burton, and who was also a member of that executive board as president from 2018 to 2020. And they're going to give us their insight about the lawsuit and what it means. I think it'll be a really interesting dichotomy from last week, having talked to Tom Eamon last week, who's the publisher of Sailing Illustrated, certainly one of the leading voices for media and for sailing in North America. We're going to have that conversation, and I think you'll find it pretty cool. Second thing we're going to do is a little bit more live. We're going to bring you a chance to spend some time learning something. Wally Cross is going to join us with his system sailing, and Wally's going to spend some time on each of our shows over the next, 18 to 20 weeks, discussing the specifics about his sailing system. And we start off this week with the first lesson. We will eventually get out on the water and try to bring you a little more live coverage in that situation, but obviously it's still a little bit too cold for boats. So we're going to take those considerations and move forward. Couple of housekeeping issues. First one, DYRA, as you can see the schedule here, right here next to my head. And if you get a chance to check out some of those great seminars, those they've got coming up both in February. We've got one coming up February 8th. So check those out. And I think you'll find it to be really insightful and enjoyable. And the second part, Harry Jones has asked if anybody's looking at sweatshirts for the Detroit Community Sailing Center, which is Challenge the Wind. Don't buy those sweatshirts because they're a fraud. They're an absolute fraud. And Harry works hard enough as a volunteer to make sure his organization and his kids have opportunity. Let's not be giving money to grifters. So that being said, take a note from that. And we will be back with Gary Jobson just a second. Welcome back. We're talking with the great immortal Gary Jobson. Gary, we appreciate you coming aboard. We're going to talk a little bit today about the lawsuit that U.S. Sailing is involved in. And it comes off of a tough weekend. Obviously, you were down in Savannah with the award ceremonies. And we had a chance last week to talk to Tom Eamon about the premise and the promise and all the stuff that goes with it. So I guess my simple first question to you is, you having been the president of U.S. Sailing 2010 to 2012, do you have any thoughts on it?
So it's been a decade since I was president of U.S. Sailing. So time's gone by. I'm not on the board. I'm not on the nominating committee, and I'm on no committee. So I don't really have any official function here. But when I did become president of U.S. Sailing, I did have a very tough legal situation with a windsurfer, Farrah Hall, and she had a protest against U.S. Sailing, and it dealt with redress. And I was able to recruit Dave Perry, who's one of the geniuses with the racing rules of sailing, and the two of us met with Farrah Hall and her representatives and lawyer, and with representatives of the U.S. Olympic Committee. And we had a session that lasted 10 hours, and we solved all the problems. And the basic issue was, if you are a party to a protest that involves redress, should you be able to be in the hearing? And the answer is yes. And so the prescriptions to the racing rules of sailing got changed. So the solution that I dealt with was to get all the parties in the room and talk it out and come up with a fair resolution for everybody.
The conversation seems to be you don't sue your members, which is kind of part of that discussion. And the public relations standpoint, you're suing somebody in an Olympic year. Given all that is true, it seems like a pretty serious PR faux pas. And I understand that you have to sue when you have to sue, but it just seems a little odd. And then the criticism comes because you've got a new CEO who I actually have some background with. My wife worked with him for 15 years at the Detroit Pistons, and he's a non-sailor. So there's a criticism, comes with the neighborhood of sort of teenage boys pointing a finger because you don't understand sailing. But I think any thoughts on the timing of the lawsuit?
Well, let's see. The first race of the Olympic Games starts in a little over 5 months in Marseille. So the window is short. We don't know everybody that's attending the games yet from the United States. That'll get resolved in the next 8 weeks or so. We'll have it. So time is short. And I certainly hope the lawsuit that's been lodged doesn't affect the athletes. You know, they're busy enough, and it's a hard gig. And as you know, the United States won 0 medals last time, and 1 medal in 2016 and 0 medals in 2012. So it's not like the United States is strong like we were between 1984 and 1992 when we won 21 medals in 24 classes. So our young sailors have their work cut out for them to do well, and distractions aren't helpful. As far as the lawsuit itself, I've read all the papers, and I read the brief press response that America One had, and I suspect that we're going to hear a lot more about it in the coming months. And to my feeling is, it sure would be good if they could all sit down and hash it out and come to some kind of agreement or arrangement, because lawsuits don't help anybody. And this is a lawsuit that's going to go on for a few years. And there'll be a new administration at U.S. Sailing, at least a new president and some new board members. And the Olympics will be long over by the time this gets decided. So if there was a way to solve it early, it'd probably be to everybody's benefit.
Interviewing Alan Osfield last year and having a conversation with him about 2 weeks ago, one of the precepts that he talked to us about was sort of changing the culture of U.S. Sailing from instead of being a volunteer group driven, an organization driven from volunteers up, it's sort of becoming, or trying to become, an organization that's by a board and driving it from the top down, sort of a completely organizational change in the way they operate. U.S. Skiing, U.S. Lacrosse, U.S. Number of organizations are really top driven. U.S. Sailing is not. Do you see that as an issue?
Well, one of the problems that the sport of sailing has is that we're so diverse. There's so many different pieces. You know, volleyball, you have men's volleyball and women's volleyball, and do you play with 2 players or do you play with 9 players is always a question. But sailing is very diverse, and I think it's hard to wrap your hands around that. I mean, on a positive note, in Savannah last week, there were well over 400 people there at the National Sailing Program Symposium, and nobody was talking about lawsuits. Nobody was talking about the Olympics either, by the way. They were all talking about sailing programs and getting kids out in the water and getting adult instruction and how to do things better. So, I sat in on some of the conferences and seminars, and I came away feeling pretty good that there's a lot of engaged people in this country that want to get more people on the water and do it safely and be more competitive and have more fun. So that part of it was really good.
Should U.S. Sailing, let me ask you a better question. Should the Olympics be driven by its own entity, or, much like America One was doing in terms of financial process? Because if you've got this landscape where you're covering a lot of area and a lot of business, somebody made mention to me that, they're involved in, motorboat safety. Well, I don't know of a regatta that doesn't use motorboats, So I get the premise, but would it help us, since we've been so poor in performance at the Olympic levels, and to some extent nationally? There's always been the argument that, pro sailing sort of cut into our ability to have amateur sailors. But my question is, should Olympic sailing be settled and have its own group and its own body to run it?
Well, the question of the structure of our Olympic team has been going on since I've been around in the early 1970s. So this is not a unique issue and problem. And historically, I'm going back to 72, 76, 80, which we didn't actually go, 84, 88, 92. You had a chairman of the U.S. Olympic Sailing Committee. Actually, it was called Yachting Committee at the time. And there was a committee that they had, and that chair sat on the board of U.S. Sailing and basically gave a report what they were doing and left it at that. So it was kind of a separate committee, just like an offshore committee or the One Design Class Council or the Training and Education Committee. But this time it changed a little bit, where the entire board was the group engaged with the Olympics and not a separate group. So, I mean, I think it's a darn good question, and I think U.S. Sailing should take a good look at what other sports do, and analogous governance and what goes on internationally with some of the other national governing bodies in the sport of sailing. Because the issue is we haven't done well in Olympic competition. Now, in fairness, I do think parity has come to our sport. So one country like the United States is not going to dominate, but surely we can do better than we've been doing. And that starts with young people early on. So you got to sync up collegiate sailing, you got to sync up yacht club training, you got to get funding going. And I mean, there's a lot of elements to make this work. And the goal should be to look beyond Marseille in 2024. And, you know, we're back home in LA in 2028, and we did really well 40 years ago in 1984 with, you'll recall, 7 medals in 7 classes with 3 golds and 4 silvers. Can we get there again when we're on our home waters? And that should be the goal, how to make things a little bit better.
In a world of what have you done for me lately, those are great memories, but it doesn't always necessarily play. Just a curious question: does college racing, a lot of our young athletes who've had, you know, variety of experiences up until college, then you go from basically faster boats to slower boats and different kinds of boats. Those 4 years in the boats in the collegiate level, does that hurt us in the Olympic pipeline?
So, you know, I grew up through the collegiate sailing, and heck, I was the college sailor of the year twice and did all of it. And I came away from college sailing with some really good things and some things not so good. What's good, I knew the rules, really good at boat handling, great getting off the starting line, you know, mark roundings, all of that is excellent. I had no knowledge of boat tuning, long course racing, international competition. And, you know, I really had a deficit for the rest of my career because I didn't have any of that in collegiate sailing. In my view, college sailing, the boats are too little. So if you want a skipper, you better weigh under 150 pounds. And if you crew, you better be 110 pounds. So you're kind of limiting each generation. If you're 6'2" and 180 pounds, like I was in college, I'm more than 180 pounds now, I'm probably 200 pounds now. But you can't be competitive because the boats are too little. And there's no boat tuning. And there's no real connection to Olympic sailing. So when I won the single-handed nationals in 1972, out of the blue, I got a $300 stipend and a used fin. And, oh, you've just qualified to go to the U.S. Olympic trials. And I went. How cool is that? And, you know, we don't have any system for our top collegiate sailors to be going to an Olympic trials or, you know, by extension, the Olympic Games. So I think college sailing should work a little bit harder to format itself to help build our sailors to be more competitive on the international stage.
In looking back at U.S. sailing membership, it increases obviously the year the Olympics happen. And it does because I'm guessing because of the focus of being able to be televised and having those conversations. Doesn't jump much, but it jumps up to anywhere from 10 to 12%. Has done that the last 6 cycles. France, England, New Zealand, obviously Australia are pretty much national programs that are supporting of their sailors and do a pretty good job. And they obviously dominate the world at the moment.
Yeah, and I would add the Dutch, the Italians, and the Spanish also in that league. And you see them winning a lot of medals in Brazil. You know, we have no national funding for our Olympic team. This is the United States, and the British have done well with a lottery to get funding for their athletes, and then they only focus on some sports. If they're not good in a sport, they don't do it. And in the U.S., we try to fund all our different sports, and we rely on corporate sponsors and individual donors, and it puts a hell of a lot of pressure on young sailors. You know, you're 24 years old and trying to sail all the time, and you got your hat upside down running around fundraising. That's tough. You know, Buddy Melgas, when he won his gold medal, he didn't have a sailing coach in 1972. That was rare. So coaching is a relatively new phenomena, and that's expensive too. You go to an Olympic venue, and I've covered a lot of Olympic games, and it's astounding to me how many coach boats are out and around there. And it's expensive doing all that. So how to do well in the Olympics is a darn good question. There's been a lot of talk about it, but clearly in the U.S., we need to do better, and governance is part of it.
I think of even some of the small changes for pro athletes in general, nutritionists and chiropractors and things that we'd never thought of 20 years ago that are now part of the staple of. You go to Sale GP and they've got their own kitchens. If you go around to well, I mean, we have understood that there's a connection between your nutrition, hydration, and your athletic performance. The Germans knew that East Germans knew that in the 70s with blood doping. I mean, chemistry is not exactly the first discussion, but the reason I'm asking the question is that U.S. Sailing was under Paul Kayard. He'd gone out and raised a fair amount of money. One of the models he was figuring out was the kind of following U.S. skiing model. That was part of the emphasis to build a very good, large endowment to be able to afford these things. If you look at what U.S. skiing has done from 12 years ago to now, we've become a world power to some extent. We've got some of the better skiers because they had time to be able to train and not have to worry about working at McDonald's on the weekends. And I think that's something that gets lost. And I guess that was my question. Was Kayard on the right track, or is it? A very simple question. Is it just, big rich boys arguing over, a junior high playground fight? Is it more than that?
Well, Paul Kayard certainly had a distinguished career in our sport. He was an alternate in '84, and of course, he sailed the Star to a 5th place in Athens in 2004. So he's been around the Olympic scene, and of course, his race around the world, winning the Whitbread and winning the Star World Championship and reaching the finals as a helmsman in the America's Cup is a pretty distinguished career. Paul's a guy that doesn't take any prisoners, and I don't think he tolerates things that aren't going the way it is. And, I thought he was a good choice to lead our Olympic program, and I was disappointed when he left. I talked to him afterwards, and it's kind of a sad state. So, but they hired a guy that sounds like he's pretty good, did well with the British, and he did well with the Germans. And he's got a short window here, 5 months before the first race to do well. So I hope our young sailors achieve. And there's a couple classes, maybe 3, that look like we could get a medal. The Ilka 6 and both 49er classes, men's and women's, and the women's kiteboard. That's 4 actually. Have a pretty good chance. And then maybe the 470, maybe the NACRA, certainly medal race contenders. So I'm hoping for the best, that we have a good result in Marseille. Marseille, by the way, is a pretty good place to sail. They get a nice sea breeze and beautiful town, long sailing history there. So they got a really good venue. You couldn't do this in Paris. The Seine River wouldn't work.
The gentleman you're referring to, if I'm not mistaken, is Marcus Lynch. Is that correct?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And he's got both British and English backgrounds.
Right, but he worked with the German, I think, Paralympic program and with the British. So anyway, I mean, I'm glad they got somebody in the spot to help out with the high performance, because we had a gap there for a lot of months. Getting him. First, they got to leave him alone and worry about the sailors, and there's plenty of talent coming up.
He's also got to show up. I talked to a number of guys on the trials that are involved in this past couple of weeks, and nobody's met him yet. So hopefully he ends up being around and being part of that whole thing. So it'll be fun to watch this summer.
I haven't met him before. I don't think. He might have been around some of the World Sailing events when I was on the board of World Sailing, but I don't recall that.
Okay.
Anyways, so
as long as I've got you, just maybe some highlight. I mean, just some highlights of Savannah. You had obviously were the MC for the Rolex Sailor of the Year. Well, Charlie Enright, looked like you had some fun.
Well, being on stage with the top 3 selected women's sailors and the top 3 selected men's sailors was great fun. They're all a little bit nervous. It's like the Academy Awards. Nobody knows who's actually going to win. And I didn't either, by the way. I purposely didn't want to know, because it might have slanted my questions a little bit. And there was great energy in the room. And, very diverse sailors this year. Charlie Enright doing that ocean race, and he certainly had his ups and downs, but persevered and very strong. And Alan Terhune winning the gold medal in the Pan Am Games and being a tactician, winning the 6-meter worlds in Great Britain, very cool. And Steve Hunt, alternating between being a great sailor with a 2nd and 3rds in the 470 and J70 and Etchells Worlds, and all the coaching he does at the high school level. Really strong. And on the women's side, Christina Wolf, that was kind of an unusual thing. I don't think we've seen women getting this award for offshore sailing. So that was kind of new and exciting. And Erica Reinicke's, she's doing such a great job with Ilka 6, and maybe she'll be our representative. We'll find that out soon. Daniel Morose has won this 3 years. I kind of miss seeing her on stage, but she might have her moment if she wins a medal next summer. So we'll see where she is with that. And then Betsy Allison was certainly an emotional choice. She had a very complicated surgery and very debilitating recovery. But there she was out sailing in the 2.4 meter and actually won. And there were 6 previous world champions in that class that she raced against. So she did well. And I think it would have been cool if she'd won, because it would have meant she would have been a 6-time winner. But anyway, I think Christina was a good choice, and it was great fun. And as you could see, they were all good speakers and represent our sport well. And as I mentioned earlier, having over 400 people dedicated to sail training and education and getting kids out in the water, I thought that was really good down there in Savannah.
Gary, as always, I appreciate your time, and have hopefully a great spring and into a nice, breezy, warm summer. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. I got a full roster of sailing coming up. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Welcome back. We're talking with Bruce J. Burton, who is a former president of U.S. Sailing. During, Bruce, what had to be the worst of all, 2018 to 2020, you had to walk right into the pandemic, which was certainly no picnic, especially going into an Olympic process. That was part of the whole deal. And first of all, I thank you to take the time. You're a local guy from Bayview, and I appreciate you spending a couple moments with us. And what we're talking about, we're going to talk a little bit about the lawsuit. And I guess I'll just start with the easiest of questions. Do you have any thoughts on it?
On the lawsuit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really am very disappointed to see our sport come to this. The last time we had a major piece of litigation was during, I think it was Gary's presidency, Gary Jobson's presidency, when one of the Olympic athletes sued the association. And that was successfully resolved. And I do think that cooler heads should prevail in this, and that we need to come together as a sport and resolve this without lawyers. That's my opinion as a member and as a former president.
Is that possible?
I think it is, with knowing a number of significant people in the sport that I think are very reasonably minded. If each side would listen to these people, and I won't mention their names, I think it could be resolved.
You mentioned Gary was involved in a lawsuit. Not mistaken, was it not over a protest process back in the day?
Yeah, it was. And it was back in, over Olympic trials and Olympic selection. And I'd rather not go into that. It's all public record. There's no reason to dredge up the past. But the point is, I think that you can do these things. Our sport's too small. And the bottom line is, you and I have spoken before, the athletes are the only ones that get hurt.
Yeah. That's the biggest thing. We just came off of, U.S. Sailing just came off of a big annual meeting in Savannah. Two of the questions that sort of hit my mind is that you're suing your members in a year when you have Olympics. And, the timing of it is, you got to wonder a little bit. And it's got to hurt the program a little bit. I understand it may not be, at the top of the agenda, but it's got to be. Do you think timing is not necessarily the best at this point, especially at the year of when we're trying to field an Olympic team?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere to litigate these things. And every dollar that's spent on lawyers and process, there is one less dollar available to the athletes and the coaches. So I don't care whose side you choose. It's just a very poor waste of resources. And we also know, as competitive sailors, at the top of the game, quite often the game is psychological. And the last thing that you need to have anything going on in your psyche that can be a distraction. Now, I think our athletes are, professional enough and skilled enough and experienced enough that it won't be, on their forefront of their mind or even the back of their mind when they get in the boats. But there is certainly just a lack of or a loss of proper psychological preparation with just having these kinds of distractions. Athletes and coaches should not be distracted from anything by anything. And this is just a big distraction.
Should U.S. sailing or should the Olympic sailing program be run by a separate organization? One of the complaints with a lot of folks in discussing this is that you've got this organization of U.S. Sailing that covers a variety of activities, cruising, and somebody even mentioned to me that they have power boating lessons, and I kind of pointed out to them that there's not very many regattas where they're not using power boats, but this sort of stretched out version of it, does that sort of being a master of all hurt the Olympic program, and should it be run separately by itself? You would have some insight to that, being former U.S. sailing president.
I have a lot of insight on that. I have a very, very strong opinion on it. And I'm glad you asked it, because I'd certainly like to spend the rest of we have been very unsuccessful, I believe, over the last 4 quads because our system is not correct. And we've been very much being the central governing body trying to put together a team. And that's not how we ran back before we started doing this, I'd say before 2000 or 2004. We were always a grassroots from the bottom up type of organization. And U.S. Sailing at that time basically acted like the league office. Since that time, we've tried to become a team as U.S. Sailing. We tried to run the team as the league office. And I think we need to go back to what we were back before 2000 and become a league office and not try to be a team in the World League. And if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, back when I was doing Olympic sailing, all the medals came out of yacht clubs and classes. U.S. Sailing basically ran the trials and handed the money from the U.S. Olympic Committee to the athletes. It was very simple. And if you look at swimming, the USA Swimming does not train athletes. All the training's done in clubs and in colleges. Right? And all these foreign swimmers that are winning all these medals are being trained at U.S. colleges. They're not being trained overseas, but they're all being trained at U.S. colleges. We have the most unbelievable yacht club system and college system for training athletes of any country in the world, and we are not effectively using those. So as you're probably well aware, we had an Olympic Sailing Committee that was disbanded by the board in 2020. For whatever reasons, we don't need to go into that, but to streamline the process. I was the chairman of the Olympic Sailing Committee from 2016 after the Olympics to 2020, and I was president from 2015 to 2018. So the last 2 years on the board, I served just as the chairman of the Olympic Sailing Committee, and Paul Kayard was on that committee. And we talked about it as a committee. For us to get the program to the next level, we needed to have a much more comprehensive plan than the plan that we submitted to the U.S. Olympic Committee for approval of funding. And we also had to have a pipeline to finances. And this was called Project Pipeline. It's a very, very comprehensive, very well done development program for our athletes and our coaches. And our system includes fundraising, includes everything. And McKinsey helped us do this. I think over 100 people were interviewed, who were very valuable in the sport. And Paul Kayard put the thing together. He didn't champion it as much as he put the McKinsey guys on it. And they worked independently, and they just did an absolutely fantastic job on it. Well, during that time, one of the things that I suggested to the group, the Olympic Sailing Committee, is we need to spend a little bit more time considering that we should be, as U.S. Sailing, should be the league office like the NFL, and let the yacht clubs and the classes and independent people, whoever they might be the teams, and let the free market decide where the development should go and how it should be done. And that we should be more the lubrication between the gears, being the Detroit guy, be the lubrication of the gears and the transmission, as opposed to being the gear, or the whole transmission. And we need to facilitate that. So I do think that there's a huge opportunity for training to be organized outside of U.S. Sailing. I mean, let's just face it. every time we've tried to do that, it hasn't worked. So eventually you got to stop doing what you're doing and tack the boat and sail on the other side of the race course. And it's time to do that.
Ego gets involved here, doesn't it?
It's all, I mean, the
Ego
problem.
and money.
Absolutely. It's all about power and money. It's all about power and money. And I'll tell you, I've been in a lot of volunteer boards and corporate boards, and you can take 10 really good individual people that are so well intended, and you put them together and just different things happen. I mean, it's just different things happen. If you look at the board we have at US Sailing, these are good people on this board, but stuff just happens. And there's, I'm not talking about agendas or anything. It's when you put people together, things happen corporately as a group that may not or probably would not happen individually. And I think we're in one of those situations right now with this lawsuit is like, God, each one of those board members individually, I don't think would ever want to do this, but when you put everything together, stuff just happens. And I think that, having an outside group come together and say, let's just break this thing down to the pieces and try to resolve it without these lawyers, we can come up with a much better end for everybody involved.
We got in this discussion last week. Tom Eamon had his show, and I had a chance to interview both Alan Osfield and Paul Kayard over the last 18 months. So we posted a couple of the interviews, and we asked to come aboard, and he spent some time talking about the non-sailing CEO, Alan Osfield. We have a connection to him because he had worked as the president of the Pistons. My wife was involved with the Pistons at the time, so I know him to be a pretty professional, pretty straight-up guy. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of people with great hearts. Sometimes the message gets lost and you get that much in the same room. And I sort of defended him. And then I started looking at the lawsuit and I started reading through it and started looking at the history. And I mentioned to Gary Jobson that the Olympics, if you look at U.S. sailing, we've won one medal in the last 3 Olympics. It's a bronze medal. If you look at the enrollment, it goes up during years of Olympics. It doesn't go up much. It goes up 10 to 12%. But when you're already fighting attrition on your membership anyway, you have that, I think, obligation to make sure you take advantage of that premise. And I think that's part of it. You mentioned earlier about bottom up, top down, and really that's the argument right now as part of this lawsuit. Do you see U.S. Sailing as being a better organization from being driven from the volunteers up or from a board down?
I think the foundation should be from the bottom up, absolutely. And for the reason I just said in Olympic training, our daughter Joan just married a great guy, Connor Medlow, who's from Hayling Island, England. And for the sailors know, Hayling Island is it's like Portsmouth, England, a very famous dinghy center in the UK. Okay. For their engagement party, Jane and I traveled to Hayling Island, and his sister, Connor's sister, is a sailor. Took me to Hayling Island, England. There are more Olympic class boats at Hayling Island Sailing Club than there are, I think, in the whole United States. Wow. And if we put Olympic sailing, if we encouraged our yacht clubs to have Olympic sailing, those types of classes sailed at our yacht clubs, and we encouraged our college sailors to get out of the slower boats and sail the faster boats, there was no doubt in my mind our country would return to dominance. And this is where U.S. Sailing, I could think, have the biggest influence. And you don't have to do this with money. You bring those commodores, those boards, and those members of those yacht clubs, and you buy them into this vision, and you have some professional organizations like an A1 or Oak Cliff, and you combine that with the yacht clubs and use some training centers. And, A1 could do it, in San Francisco. Oak Cliff could do it. Get, a training center. We have a beautiful one down in Miami, and you coordinate this. But if you bring it from the bottom up and you encourage these yacht clubs and those colleges to do this, we would dominate again within one quad. But it has to be that way, because I can tell you, Greg, it hasn't happened from the top down. We just got the receipt.
Yeah. And I think part of the premise is also communications. You look at the junior sailing programs around Lake St. Clair, rarely do they step outside the DYRA to race. Right. It's a very insular process because I'm not sure if it's money or lack of wanting to. I mean, that's another question for another time, but you don't see anybody stepping out. IOIA, if you go to Lake Erie, a lot of those kids were at the national level. They were down in Miami for the Optimist for that big, huge race that they have down in Miami. So part of the communications between these groups is also part of that process. You mentioned your son-in-law. Most of the Europeans, obviously French and England and Spain and some Portugal, some of those places, obviously New Zealand and Australia, support their athletes.
Mhm.
Opportunity only comes if you have money. It really,
Mhm.
that's that. If you don't have the money, there's no opportunity. So is it U.S. Sailing's job to provide funds for those kids that maybe are world class, or is it the government's?
Okay, that's a really huge question. I think in part, absolutely, it's U.S. Sailing's job to help provide funding for those people. As to the U.S. government, the U.S. government doesn't give money to any of the Olympic sports, so you know about that. But I will tell you this, the money will come if it's done locally. There is so much local money at yacht clubs, it will happen. It always has happened. And so I believe that if you have Olympic hopefuls that are committed to it, they can fund their programs with local money. And you add to that national money that comes through the USOPC and national fundraising efforts by U.S. Sailing, it can happen. I think U.S. Sailing is a very good organization when it comes to the high-level organization of clubs and programs. And I think if U.S. Sailing hosted meetings to get yacht clubs to come together, the yacht clubs would support this and say, we need to have training, outside of the national organization. We need to get this down to grind it down to the lowest level. Because, my father, when I was 15, he bought me a 470, and I didn't want to sail an Interlake. That was the DRYA boat. That thing was slow. I wanted to have a trapeze boat. And if we got 49ers and NACRAs and boards and lasers and really cranked up our local programs and really developed our national championships and our regional regattas and really promoted that and make it a bigger thing, U.S. Sailing's excellent at that. And I think if we, like you said, Greg, change the communication, change the structure, get U.S. Sailing running as a league office, really promote organizations, professional organizations and the local organizations, this thing can come to better pretty quickly. But that's a huge major, and I don't want to use the word ego change, but it is. It's like saying, okay, we failed, and to have a board do that would be Herculean, but that would be the best thing that can happen. But with a lawsuit out there, it's kind of hard to say, oh, well, we were wrong and we're going to tack the boat.
Yeah, and in the case of the lawsuit, you're suing, in some cases, America One. Those are folks that have been nothing but helpful. I mean, $6.5 million over, I think, a 4 to 5 year period is certainly part of that discussion. One question I'm curious about, and you and I had this conversation before. A lot of guys are going pro, and I think you and I talked also about when you go from junior racing to college, you're literally going slower in boats. That's part of maybe that premise. But if we have Olympic athletes that are professional, as they are in basketball, tell me why a pro athlete can't. I know you have to have 200 hours in a boat every week and every month, and you got to, you can't possibly not train a week or 2 or 3. My question is, why can't pro sailors be a part of the Olympic program?
They certainly can be. But the problem, Greg, is there's no economic viability in our sport unless you're a professional sailor, and nobody pays you to sail professionally in an Olympic boat. So look at just how it is. We've got these great college sailors. Okay, these are very talented. Now, they sail slow boats for 4 years. That's a real problem. But these kids are just as talented, just as smart as any European that's sailing the Olympic boat. It's just the Europeans are sailing Olympic boats and we're not. So you graduate from a great school. You've got a great education. Your parents have helped you through all the junior sailing programs. You go to a great school and okay, you're going to graduate. Here's your choices. I can go get a great job and get a lot of money. I can go to graduate school, or I can do an Olympic program. And the Olympic program is going to cost me anywhere from $150,000 a year to $300,000 a year. And you go to your parents and say, you just spent $250,000 or more on my college. I'd like you to spend $250,000. That was over 4 years. I want you to spend $250,000 a year every year. Oh, and I can raise some money from the club. Now, which choice are you going to make? I'd become a professional sailor. That's what I do, because I can get paid $100,000 or $150,000 a year to go sailing and have just as much fun, as an Olympic program.
Yeah. The one thing we found out in the ski model was that, and I think the bottom price for a development kid up, and it's graduated depending on where we are in the team. But the bottom line is $125,000 is the number of that they're getting, and that's salary, it's housing, it's food, it's a variety of travel covers in that. But that number seems to be sustenance enough to be able to keep those guys on the road to train to be able to do it. They don't have to work, as I pointed out to Gary, they don't have to work at McDonald's on the weekend. And if you start to look at the bottom of the U.S. team now, it's starting to come. You obviously, you've had Lindsey Vaughns and Michaela Schifrins and Bruce Beckett's, but now the bottom of the national team is competitive. You know, we've had guys on the podium, and mostly because they're able to work at their sport. They have nutritionists. Go to Salt Lake and look at the U.S. ski headquarters, where guys, they've got a hotel across the street that they bought that you can actually go stay. So they don't have to scrimp and scrape and do all the rest of it. And the other part of it is the guys at the top of U.S. Sailing, the CEO is only making $200,000. He ain't making big bucks. I'm not saying that's not good money, and he was a millionaire to start with, but they're practical about their approach. They're pragmatic about what they're trying to do for the kids. And I guess that's kind of where this starts, which is basically what you're saying.
Well, it goes back to there's no intrinsic economic viability in our sport, in the sense that there's no commercial interest. You don't have ABC Sports knocking on your door and say, we've got to show the 49er National Championship, you know, or the 49er World Championship. But they do want to show the World Championship when it comes to ski racing.
Right.
So, you know, it's you don't have that economic viability.
Right.
So you have to create it through a love of the sport, which has to happen from the bottom up.
Do we have the ability? Do you think we have the ability to change this, or do you think it gets locked in egos and it's a long court fight? And I guess that would be my last question to you.
Greg, that's above my pay grade. I have no idea. I just hope by me saying these things that if anybody listens to it, they could step back and just say, look, what's the best thing for the athletes? Coming together on behalf of the sport's the best thing. And let's lay down our swords and just get through this.
You guys pull together and developed a great plan. You'd think somebody would pull it out of a drawer and at least look at it to give it a possibility. Because you're in this position, I think you have some responsibility to uncover every rock to make sure that those kids have an opportunity. And let's hope that's the case. Well, listen, Bruce, I appreciate you spending time with us, and will hopefully be what's left of the winter. At 55 degrees today, it's hard to say that, especially to a skier. But at the same time, you could get it work on the boat. So great spring, and hopefully warm winds this summer.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me on the show.
I certainly would like to thank Gary Jobson and Bruce Burton for talking about U.S. Sailing and the lawsuit. And hopefully we can get this resolved and moved, sort of off the table, especially with the Olympics coming in here in 2024 in France this coming summer. Up next is the great Wally Cross. We only bring you the best sailors in the world on this show. So Wally's up next with his sailing systems, and I think you'll enjoy the tip. So stay tuned.
Welcome back. We're talking with Wally Cross, who is one of the better sailors in this country. And Wally, we're going to spend some time this entire year inside Great Lakes Sailing with some tips from you. And I don't want to say tips because it's really more of as your book points out and your PDFs point out, a sailing system. And we're going to start slow, and we're eventually going to do some on-the-water activity. But I want to start and explain, so you can explain a little bit about how it developed. And you kind of first picked it up by reading a book. And the book was by, and I want to say Stuart Walker. Stuart Walker. You're a cerebral guy who wants to learn how to sail. And I think if you listen to what you're going to do, we're going to start with a tip today. But I want to explain what sailing systems is to somebody like me who's not real bright.
No problem. You're plenty bright. But I appreciate this too, because for me, I take great pleasure in providing information systems per se to people that truly just enjoy sailing for the fun of it, not for the profession of it, not for the Olympics, not for anything other than just pure joy. Someone that works hard all day long, gets a boat, the best boat they can afford, gathers their friends together and goes out on a Wednesday night, Tuesday night, Monday night, whatever, and just enjoys the sport and loves talking about it, but still wants to perform at the highest level possible, which means they want to win or be in that upper group, if you will, so that they can walk away and feel proud of how they've sailed their boat and their accomplishments. But it's that group of people I thoroughly enjoy. I've sailed with many professionals all my life, and I've sailed with people that aren't professionals, and I truly enjoy sailing with the people that like it for fun. So my thought was to come up with a program, if you will, that offers a way for people to just organize their sailing a little bit so that when they go out and make an improvement, it doesn't all go away by the next time they go out. They have a way of tracking it, recording it, measuring it, and thinking maybe if we just do what we did today, but change one thing in a systematic way, we can make small improvements. And small improvements lead to big improvements, ultimately better results.
And you've also, this is kind of a revolving program. We interviewed you for the second ever Inside Great Lakes Sailing Show. We talked about the sailing system then. You've now put out more information. You put out, I know recently you sent me a PDF on some other information that relates to sailing. So this is kind of a growing educational model. Is that a fair point?
It is a fair point. It's a sort of a building block, but it's a building block that you never lose any of the blocks. You just keep building upon that, so that with the ultimate goal that you've got a consistent, well-rounded program, sailing with your friends, getting good results and feeling good about the sport and wanting to come back next year. That's the secret. You don't want to have a program where it was great one year, bad the next year, and then quit the sport and take up golf. I don't want that. I want people to enjoy their experience each year, make improvements each year, so that they want to come back. Kind of like, golf. If get that last par, last birdie, that last hole makes you want to come back. I was sailing with Stephen Kircher in the IC37 North Americans this last fall, and we were struggling early on to get our systems down, but at the end, we had a couple of great races, and it felt so good. He's chomping at the bit to come back. So that's the experience I want people to go through.
Innovation in almost every sport comes from the racing end of it. I think of guys will talk about skis, and I come from that world a little bit. Everybody says, well, I really want a turning ski. Well, why not use a race ski? Because it's a shorter radius. It makes more sense. The point I was going to ask you is that you can learn about cruising, but it's going to help you with racing. Just because you cruise doesn't mean you don't want to learn something from racing, and I think it's the same point. Is setting sails, are they interchangeable between cruising and racing as far as you're concerned?
Absolutely they are, because a lot of the things that we do in race sails to make race sails at a higher level of performance works directly with cruising. The better the sails, the better the sail trim, the better the shapes are, makes the sport of cruising easier. The boat doesn't tip over as fast. It's easier to steer. It just performs at a higher level. It's just more enjoyment. It relates to cars too. A well-driven car is a better driving experience than a car that's just bumping along the road. So absolutely, and there's some fabulous cruising boats out today that are enjoying this. You see these beautiful boats that are just at the highest level of performance, and they're just enjoying the sport. You don't have to race to have a great sailing experience.
Sailing is skill, certainly. You can't just go out on a sailboat without having at least some level of skill. That said, your experience, do you think most folks, and I'm not talking about necessarily the top end of the racers, but do you think most folks understand all they need to know about a sailboat?
No, of course not. I don't understand, nowhere near. Nobody does,
Okay.
and that's the beauty of the sport, is that you can keep learning without being embarrassed. So often in many sports, you feel like if you're the best, you know everything there is about it. We had this discussion earlier, the difference between professional sailors and people that do it for fun. The pros think they know it all. They don't, but they think they do. But the people that do it for fun, they'll never say that. They just want to figure out how to just enjoy their friends a little bit more by improving their performance.
Okay. Well, we're going to have about somewhere between 12 and 18 parts of our show this year. You're going to be a part of every show. We're going to do about 6 or 7 of those live.
Okay.
In the loft here, and then hopefully we'll get on a boat and see it rather than maybe talk about it. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a second.
Hi, hello. Wally Cross, Quantum Sales, and it's now February, and time to think about your boat if you haven't already. And surely in February, what I like to do is start with a clean piece of paper and just write down all the improvements you wanted to make last year in the fall. Maybe you already have, but if you haven't, just write down all the improvements. And then on the other side of the paper, write down what you think you can budget for these improvements. They may be sails, they may be instruments, it might be running, rigging, it might be a variety of different things. And then give it a value of how important, which one is going to make the biggest difference. Now, for me, I always suggest that if you only have $10 to spend on your boat, spend $9 on the bottom and $1 with me for sales, because the one you spend with me for sales is going to look really good based on the $9 you spend on the bottom. The bottom is clearly the most important part of the boat that should be focused on this time of year. Is the keel fair? Is the rudder fair? Is the keel and the rudder in line with each other? How's the finish? Are the scuppers or the through hulls flush? Is the rudder close to the hull? Is the prop fair? All these little things make a big, big difference. I'd like to say that the sails make the biggest difference, but it's just not the case. The bottom is number one. So your boat most likely is out of the water. So take the time right now and look over your boat, take pictures, and if you have questions, ask me. I hope that helps. Look forward to talking to you next time.
To finish our second show of our 5th season, I just wanted to thank Wally and Gary and certainly Bruce Burton for all they've meant to sailing and certainly what they've provided for our show. And we will bring you another show in a couple of weeks. We're going to bring the Mac update next week. And I think some exciting news, hopefully, for a boat called Reliance as it relates to the Mackinac race. We'll see if we can work some things out, but that'll be news for next week. That said, we hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time. And for all the guys in back, thank you.